faculty, and the entire university community. I'd like to welcome everybody here for the final program of Journalism Week. As you know, the journalism program is relatively new here, and it's been the Day Students Association's pleasure to assist in a really fine week of programs emphasizing what a journalist has to go through in order to get a story. And I'd like to introduce to you the person who is the director of the program, Professor David Onancia. David?
Do I have to do anything with this thing? It's pointing to my face. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I join Bill in welcoming you here to the closing session of what was Journalism Week. I'm going to take the easy way out. I've invited Mr. Raymond Hurd, who is managing editor of the Montreal Star, to introduce our guest speaker this afternoon. Ray joined the Montreal Star in 1962 and was Washington correspondent from 1964 to 1973. After that, he went off to South Africa, and then he went off to the Observer in London. And now he's come back to Canada, and he's here with us. Ray?
I'd like to introduce to you a man who, during the 12 years that I was in Washington, was regarded as the best investigative correspondent or reporter that there was in town. I know that you people, or some of you, expected to hear Carl Bernstein. I, having worked with both of them, would rather hear Seymour Hersh. He broke the story about My Lai, which certain people who have been sending out magazines here seem to think was a cop-out story. In my opinion, was not a cop-out story. It was a very valid one which helped change opinion in North America and the world about the war. He did that. He later moved on to do what I think was the great story of the Nixon era, which was to prove that the Nixon administration was illegally bombing the sovereign country of Cambodia. He broke that story at the time that Watergate appeared to be the great issue, but in fact, what Nixon did in bombing Cambodia was more unconstitutional than what he did in the Watergate affair. He has done other things. I can recommend him to your attention as a great reporter, and if anyone is prepared, as some apparently are, to discuss his credentials and to suggest that he's a sort of second agent for the CIA, I would like to debate that with them after this discussion. Seymour Hersh.
I think what I'm going to talk about, is this all right? Can everybody hear? I guess I have a thesis about being a reporter. Let's say I've been an investigative, or whatever that word means, a newspaper reporter since 1958 or 59. And I guess you can call me a cynic. I'm one of those people who thinks that right now, largely because, I guess, of Watergate, I, along with Woodward and Bernstein and other reporters, we've all been elevated to some sort of new folk hero status. I guess I think that's a laugh riot. Having worked in Washington for 10 years, 65 to 75, as a journalist, news is, how to describe news? Everybody remembers the Elizabeth Ray scandal with Congressman Wayne Hayes. I assume that played big here, did it not? The mistress in the House. When I first got to Washington as a kid reporter in '65, I was taken on a tour of the new Rayburn House office building, one of the congressional office buildings, by a fellow reporter. We were walking down the halls, and in one wing of the Rayburn office building, I noticed that pardon me, this is relevant if sexist, but anyway, every secretary was gorgeous, beautiful, pretty, beyond belief. And I asked Ed Leberton was the fellow with me, and I said, my God, all these gorgeous women. He said, oh yes, he said, this wing's famous for him, he said, we call them the monkeys. And I said, the monkeys? Why? He said, well, because they hold on to their jobs by their tails, all right? Laughed, I must have laughed like, it's the funniest line I heard in years. A story? I never thought it was a story. It never occurred to me. I thought about it after the Elizabeth Ray scandal. Maybe I was derelict. I think the point is that news is sometimes pretty much what you make it. In the case of all the hoopla over the press and Watergate, I've got a thesis for you. With the exception of Woodward and Bernstein, I think, I don't think the press did terribly well on Watergate, the American press, particularly the Washington press. And I can almost argue, and I think I will, just for the hell of it, I'm open for questions on anything later, but let me just tell you what's on my mind. I think you could almost say that the press was, the Washington press corps was in a way responsible for Watergate. Far from being the heroes that exposed Nixon and saved democracy in the United States. And by the way, I was at a seminar here this morning, and you people have a lot of problems. Really, I wish somebody in Canada would do more about the official secrecy laws, or at least I wish the press would get more agitated about it. I was at a conference last fall about it, and in the States, it's really remarkable. I can sit here and say, as somebody, I've written a lot about, let's see, the stories, Ray mentioned the CIA in Cambodia. I also did the stories on the CIA in Chile and the CIA in domestic spying. Stories that I guess involve national security, whatever that is. And also I did the stories on the CIA and that submarine, the Glomar Explorer. Remember, we went 3 miles down to pick up an 18-year-old submarine at the cost of about $1 billion. Anyway, it's always like, it's quite a crazy show. My thesis for the CIA, by the way, is simple. I think the way to handle the CIA, since we obviously can't get rid of the CIA in the United States, I mean, no matter what you expose about them, no matter how well they're investigated by congressional committees, what we ought to do is take all those agents and put them on B-17 aircrafts, get them out of, the ones that we used in World War II, get them back from Paramount Movies Theater, 20th Century Fox, rent them back for a couple of weeks, put these guys all on it once a year, fly them over across the ocean into Norway, and let them parachute out and blow up some bridges. And, we pay the Norwegians or reparations later. But get rid of all that energy. And then they don't have to spend $1 billion to go 3 miles down to pick up 1/3 of an 18-year-old submarine and call it national security or a great operation. Anyway, my thesis is, as a journalist, is that I think I'm free to publish any secret that I can get my hands on in the United States. And under the Constitution, I and my editors, of course, we decide whether it's in the national interest. I've been involved in that decision. In the case of the submarine caper, we held off on that story. The Times had just published the stuff on Chile and published the stuff on the CIA and domestic spying, and I guess there was a point at which the editors thought they'd done enough, for the within the last 6 months, so we held off. But we decided to hold off. And then we decided to publish. And that's a freedom that really, people are always telling me that Canadians are often confused about what the law is and what the law isn't. Basically, I guess it's television. You always see these TV shows and think that you're Americans. Your press isn't. It doesn't have much freedom. And I'm constantly amazed that there isn't more action taken, particularly not only in terms of national security, but also in terms of straight financial data that's denied to you. That's a separate issue. Anyway, I'm just saying, where I'm coming from is that I've always felt as a journalist, it's always been my right to decide what national security is for my country. And that's an arrogant statement, but I don't mean it personally arrogant, it's professionally arrogant. I can conceive of very few secrets that I really think wouldn't be worth publishing. I mean, that's all a game anyway to keep people happy, a lot of the security business. So anyway, we ought to get into that if somebody has some questions. Let me tell you about Nixon, and let me tell you how my perception of Watergate perhaps differs from yours. And in fact, I venture in most cases it will. He's elected, January the 20th, 1969. And by the way, I'm going to kick Nixon around a lot this morning. But I should say that it's a little unfair in that Nixon's perceptions on foreign policy and his perceptions on the right of the American president to deceive the American people, to lie to the American people directly, to misrepresent his views to the American people, to misrepresent his views to Congress. I don't think Nixon, in terms of foreign affairs, differed very much from Lyndon Johnson, who, after all, gave us the Gulf of Tonkin, the Vietnam War. Or in a very significant way, I don't think it differed that much from Jack Kennedy, who gave us Jack Kennedy for me, President Kennedy for me, I think in terms of his legacy for me is nation building, fortified hamlets, strategic warfare, strategic hamlets, Green Berets. As an old Vietnam nut, I can't help but think, and by the way, the Kennedys were very useful in the CIA, very anxious to push the CIA around all over the world. I don't think Nixon was that different. Obviously, Nixon was a run-of-the-mill common criminal when it came to Watergate, no question about that. But his perceptions on foreign policy, by and large, what he thought he could do, I don't see that much of a differentiation. Okay, the guy gets into office January the 20th, 69. January the 23rd, he's been in office 3 days. I'm not even assuming you can count. I'll leave out the, I'll let you do the counting. On the 23rd, a group of Marines in the northern part of South Vietnam, a battalion, 700 men, are picked up by helicopters, flown into Laos, engaged the North Vietnamese on the ground there for about a week, 10 days. We bloody their noses, they bloody our noses, the guys are choppered out, there's some casualties on both sides, no big deal, except that we went across the border into a country towards which we had not declared war. Theoretically, we were neutral. We had never gone on the ground into Cambodia. It was an extension of the war. Lyndon Johnson had been asked no less than 4 times in the previous calendar year by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the men who run the Pentagon, to let our troops go on the ground in the Laos to engage the North Vietnamese, and he had said no. And I don't think because of any great belief in international law, by the way. I think Johnson probably told his generals, fellas, you're not doing so well in the one ground war you're in now. Why go into another one? But nonetheless, we said no. Nixon got in, policy changed. All right, in itself, no big deal. February the 16th, in office less than a month, 1969. Nixon meets in the White House with Mr. Rogers, the Secretary of State, Mr. Laird, the Pentagon, head of the Pentagon, Mr. Kissinger, of course, Mr. Helms of the CIA, and they decide to bomb Cambodia secretly. This is in part along with their policy of expanding the war on the ground in the Laos. We're also going to expand the war into the area in Cambodia, another country towards which we've maintained neutrality, at least in terms of our utterances and our stated policy. March 16th, the first bombing takes place. It took almost a month to set up because, as some of you recall, Ray mentioned it briefly, this was the bombing, the famous secret bombing of Cambodia. The orders were that we were to bomb Cambodia, but the military, the B-52s that were doing it, their headquarters were to report the bombs as having fallen in South Vietnam. An elaborate mechanism was set up so that there was a series of lies inside the military's own secret channels. So over the next 14 months, the United States Strategic Air Force dropped 110,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. They conducted 3,630 sorties, always reporting the bombs which fell in Cambodia as having fallen in South Vietnam. Anybody remember Tom Lehrer and his satirical songs? When I think of that, I always think of, when I think of the Cambodian bombing, I always think of the line about Werner von Braun. He aimed for the moon but often hit London. We're bombing Cambodia but telling everybody it's South Vietnam. All right, that went on. May 1969, Nixon's been in office less than 4 months. The New York Times, in an article about the war and its various ramifications, just mentions one bombing mission in Cambodia. Doesn't describe it as systematic, doesn't describe it as illegal, doesn't describe it as being done in a lying mechanism. Panic in the White House. We now know this from the records of the House impeachment investigation. Mr. Kissinger's on the phone to Henry Kissinger, I'll just say, regardless of his merits as a negotiator, and I'm going to have to wait and see, like everybody else is, about what really happened with the latest South African negotiations. I have found him to be, in my experiences, basically about a 9-year-old liar. Did you take that quarter from my purse? No. Okay, that's where I find him. It's very amazing. Kissinger, who has consistently misrepresented his role in this, what I'm going to discuss next. Anyway, Kissinger's on the phone 4 times to Hoover. That same day, I think it was March 9th, out of these discussions begins the first of what is to be 17 illegal, unconstitutional wiretaps. They're on 13 members of the Nixon administration, including 3 or 4 of Kissinger's own personal aides, a couple of them his very close friends, Mort Halperin, Winston Lord, 4 newspaper men. They are wiretapped between May 1969 and February 1971, not altogether, for various lengths of time. 21 months? Illegal wiretapping conducted illegally by a separate unit of the FBI. This wiretapping, as I said, began in May 69. In April 30th or May 1st, depending on what side of the world you're on, we attacked Cambodia, the famous Cambodian incursion, if you remember that. Remember the outcry in the United States about that, the Kent State outbreak, the shooting of 4 students. Nixon goes on television. At this point, he's dropped 110,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. Tells the American people, I assume it was broadcast here too, that he's explaining the operation on the ground in Cambodia, and he looks him, you know, he's got, mind you, he's got the tie clasp and the photograph of Lincoln in the background, or the portrait of Lincoln on his desk, and he says, "We have never violated the neutrality of Cambodia." It's without a doubt the all-time whopper for a president. At this time, he had 3,600 missions, and he looked us in the eye, and he said, "We have not violated the neutrality." Secretary of State Rogers later went before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to explain the Cambodian operation in a secret testimony that never was made public. Eventually, somebody gave me a copy 4 years later. He told the senators, "We have not violated the neutrality of Cambodia in thought, word, or deed," he said. At that point, having been in on the original planning. So by 1970, by May 1970, what do you have? You have a president who's expanded the war on the ground illegally and without much noise in the press in Laos. He's expanded the war on the air in the air in Cambodia for 14 months, no less. He's begun wiretapping his own aides and newspaper men unconstitutionally, illegally. By the middle of 1970, by the same time, May 1st, 1970, the CIA was then in the third of what was to be a 6-year program of domestic spying against radicals, and Black Panthers, by the way, other dissidents. One of the things that's frustrated me about the domestic spying story, when I first heard about the domestic spying, the first person who ever told me about it in some detail told me about Black Panther operations in the CIA. I never was able to confirm those. I confirmed everything else, but I couldn't confirm that they were setting up Black Panthers. In other words, they were infiltrating the organization and causing them to, getting dissidents who would then, attack the honky police or what. Anyway, they had their own agents inside the Black Panthers who triggered much of the shooting. I could never confirm that. I don't know if it's true. But anyway, that's how I started. Nixon, as I said, the CIA was then in the third of what was to be a 6-year program. That program began under Johnson, but under Nixon it got a tremendous boost. In 1970, the same year we're in now, Nixon approved the increase in the number of full-time agents inside the CIA assigned to monitoring domestic activities from something like 34 to something like 55 or 52, an increase of about a third or more. Also, by May 1st, 1970, the CIA was then in the second year of what was to be a 4-year program in Chile, aimed initially at preventing the election of Mr. Allende in the elections there. When that failed, then doing what the CIA has since called destabilizing the regime of Mr. Allende. As you all know, he was overthrown in 1973, either was killed or committed suicide in the process. Just last week in Washington, one of his former ambassadors was murdered, presumably by intelligence agents from the fascist government there. That program was then, as I say, in the second year. I hope if you're beginning to see a point, maybe you're not, maybe I better tell you what the point is. Where were we? Where were we in the Washington Press Corps? Where were we when we went on the ground in Cambodia, in the air in Laos, when he began the wiretapping, when he sicked the CIA in Chile, when he sicked the CIA and American students? Where in the hell were we? How can we, in the Press Corps, have the self-deception to consider Watergate a victory for us? I mean, it's totally baffling to me. Let's go on. The chronology is really, it's interesting when you look at it from this point of view. Forget Woodward and Bernstein. At this point, they're not here yet. We're still in 70. In 71, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, and the White House response was to set up something known as the Plumbers Unit. Anybody ever read the comics? I'm sure you all do. The Katzenjammer Kids is what I like to think of them. This is the 4-man unit assigned to investigate Dr. Daniel Ellsberg. Among them was a man named David Young, a White House attorney, Eagle Crow, another White House attorney, a former CIA agent named E. Howard Hunt, and a former FBI agent named Gordon Liddy. And by the way, of all those guys, Liddy is by far the most interesting. Of all the people in Watergate, Liddy is the one guy. You have to have respect for Liddy in a way because he's still in jail. He hasn't talked to anybody yet. He's still waiting for Nixon to give him the word that it's okay to talk. My own theory is that he's convinced this is 1943 and he's in the OSS and he's been captured behind the French lines by the Gestapo. And he's just going to wait. You know, he's not going to speak to those Germans. And which is pretty remarkable for a guy who was designated by the White House. He's so weird. I was at a party about 3 years ago. This is a digression. I'll get back. He was at a party about 3 years ago. I was at a party. Some guy, Bill Shannon, who writes a column for the Times, did a book on Watergate, and there was a party. And a woman grabbed me at the party, what we in Washington call a dowager, an elderly lady. Father, I'm sure. She was the unmarried daughter of a senator who was in her 60s. They're all over Washington. She told me this story, that she had moved into a house, and a new house in northwest Washington that she purchased from somebody named G. Gordon Liddy in 1971. Now, Liddy at this time had just been moved into the White House. He was then working in the drug abuse, or the alcohol and tax revenue agency of the Treasury Department. He was a cop tracking down I don't know what. She purchased the house, and they had fixed it up. Liddy had moved, and she or a friend was just literally moving in, and they were hammering a photograph or a portrait. They were putting a portrait into a wall, in a double brick outside wall where the fireplace was, plastered over. And a friend of hers banged, or her maintenance man or somebody banged, drove a nail into the plaster, and heard it clink, dug around a little bit, and pulled out a spent bullet. Well, to make a long story short, which the lady did not do, they eventually found 2,000 bullet shells, fragments, in the wall. They had to take down the plaster and re-brick the wall. And they had been put there, of course, by Mr. Liddy. And one gets the impression, my fantasy is there's G. Gordon Liddy, 2 6-guns in his lap, watching SWAT, right? And like they say, getting it off, at the right time into the wall. Anyway, very strange man. And he's picked to become a White House cop. As Hunt later told the stewardess, there was testimony in California in some hearing, the stewardess testified that he told her on a plane, he was telling her how important he was, and he was explaining that he was a great romanticizer, Mr. Hunt, and he explained that he was even bigger than the FBI and the CIA. He was above them. He showed all his cards, and he probably was. These guys running around, propositioning women, making a lot of noise, and we in the press corps, when they broke into Dr. Daniel Ellsberg's office, which is another great crime the White House authorized. If you remember the break-in into the not Dr. Ellsberg's office, his psychiatrist's office. Dr. Fielding was his name, Louis Fielding. They did that in California, Hunt and Liddy. That was another great crime committed by the White House that we, of course, did not know about. And what bothers me about the plumbers is how badly they operated. How, unlike whoever killed the Chilean ambassador, Mr. Letelier, in Washington last week, whoever did that were professionals. The way the United States works, which is probably one of its great advantages, I think, is we're so clumsy at this kind of stuff. Hunt and Liddy had hired 3 Cuban Americans to do the break-in in Dr. Fielding's office. I'm going to tell you about that break-in, and I want you to relate it to what we all know about Watergate. You remember about the Watergate break-in. There was a piece of tape left over the door, and that's what led the guard to find him. And in the Democratic National Headquarters in June 1972. September the 3rd or 2nd, over Labor Day, 1971, Hunt and Liddy lead a team of 3 Cuban Americans to California to break into the office of Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist. The premise, mind you, the premise of the White House police was that Ellsberg was in therapy or analysis with Dr. Fielding, who I think was a psychoanalyst. So he's in analysis. And I guess the presumption was, Hunt's theory was, and I think Hunt really believed this, that while in his psychiatric trance, he would mention the names of his fellow Russian agents, that is, Dr. Ellsberg would, with whom he'd worked to get the Pentagon Papers, and then the psychiatrist, I guess, as Hunt envisioned it, I'm sure Hunt thought for sure he had to have a goatee, was taking careful notes and would get the name accurately and leave it in his notes, thus justifying a reason for breaking into the psychiatrist's office. I honestly believe that's what Hunt thought he would find. I don't think other higher-ups in the White House, I think they were looking for political stuff on Ellsberg. But they snooped around the office, they took photographs. The day before, Hunt, who speaks very good Spanish, engaged the Spanish-speaking maid in the building. Dr. Fielding's office was in the second story of a two-story medical building, a standard little medical building with 4 or 5 doctors' offices in it, and a pharmacy, etc., in Beverly Hills. And he told her that he would be back the next day to deliver a package, and he came back the next day and talked to the woman who was cleaning the offices and convinced her to let him into Dr. Fielding's outer office where he left the package. He then, of course, taped the door with tape. This is from a grand jury transcript. This is in September 1971. Hunt taped the door open. He then taped the back door open. And then he and Liddy and the Cuban Americans went back, had a good night in L.A., and prepared the next day, Labor Day, to break in. Of course, the maid found the tape and took it off. Wonder why the tape was there, similar to Watergate, as I'm sure you all remember. The next day, they came back. Hunt and Liddy were doing guard duty. The 3 Cuban Americans were going to do the break-in. They were to go sterile. Sterile is a great CIA concept where you don't, if you're caught, you don't say who you are, and you don't leave fingerprints, you wear gloves. They were to go sterile so Fielding wouldn't know that they had gotten all of Dr. Ellsberg's psychoanalytical notes. Okay, they get to the back door, which is supposedly has been taped open. It's locked. So they get a crowbar and they break it open. They go upstairs to the second floor. The door to Dr. Fielding's office supposedly has been taped open. It's locked. They get a crowbar. In they go. Into the file cabinet where they had made some keys. The keys didn't work. Crowbar. Open up the file cabinet. Couldn't find anything of importance. And what do they expect? First of all, who ever heard of take it from me, psychiatrists don't go around keeping copious notes of everything they say. And also, how would they get the patronyms right if he did mention a Russian name? And also, what did they, all they were going to find, if they did find anything, were some bills. Dear Dr. Ellsberg, pay up this week or I'll turn it over to commercial credit, What are you going to find? Anyway, just the whole thing was so insane. They finally decide they have to get in the Fielding's desk drawer. Screwdriver into the drawer, look around, okay, they got a problem. They haven't found anything, besides which it's very clear to them that it's not a sterile operation. 1,000-tablet jar of Anacin around. They grab the tablet, smash it, throw the Anacin pills around, make the police think that some junkie, I guess was the thought, some junkie looking for a fix would come into a psychiatrist's office, and then once getting in would then settle for an Imprint fix or an Anacin fix. I don't know. That's what happened. This is the gang that went into Watergate. By the way, in the California case, the police within 2 days arrested an unemployed black laborer, charged him not only with that crime, with 5 others, and sentenced him to prison by the time Watergate got out. He was subsequently pardoned, of course. For whatever that means. Okay, plumbers running around, breaking in, crazy, hiring Cubans, leaving doors locked. I mean, the CIA all over the world, the military bombing any place they wanted to illegally, and we didn't get any of it. I just think it's awfully hard. I think Woodward and Bernstein deserve every bit of praise they've gotten. They were 2 reporters that did some work in 1972 to break that story, help break it open. But in fact, to think, just to have the perception that somehow the press was more on the ball is very misleading. Just to trust us that much is very misleading. I don't think we're that good. I know we're not that good. We're the same reporters in Washington, that is. We're the same press corps that when President Ford, after taking office in 1974, was it early 70? He took office in 74, the Mayaguez incident. Was that late 74? That was like a couple months after he took office. Do you remember when a group we lost the war in Vietnam. This must have been the spring of 75 this happened. We lost the war in Vietnam, we lost the war in Cambodia. And a group of Cambodian, as the story came out to the American people, a group of Cambodian seamen, communist Cambodians, seized an American freighter ship, the Mayaguez. We had to save the crew. So President Ford authorized the Air Force to attack, or authorized the Marines to land on an offshore island, losing, 41 lives? that we then bomb Cambodia. Meanwhile, it turned out that while everything was being authorized, the alleged the members of the Cambodian Navy who seized the ship released the Americans, who were later picked up. So there really was no need for the mission. This is described in the most glowing terms by the American press. Great victory for America. We can hang our head up high and all that stuff, as if everything that had gone down. I'm talking about 1975, the spring of 75. There's a great story. I went to in Washington at the UN, the North Vietnamese minister one day told me the following story. I happened to bump somebody I just know from being over in Vietnam so long, being over in North Vietnam anyway. He told me the following story. It was a joke. They had a joke, the North Vietnamese, after the My Lai incident. And the joke went like this, that the North Vietnamese had this joke, that the Cambodian foreign minister was in Peking the day before the My Lai incident took place and happened to get on a plane to come to Paris. A Russian Aeroflot prop plane took about 2.5, 3 days to get to Paris via Moscow. It's a terrible flight. And when he landed at Orly Airport, by this time, of course, the My Lai had been seized, the men had been released, there had been bombings, the Marines had landed, had been shot, and the United States had declared it a great victory for American foreign policy. And this is what was in the headlines. When the Cambodian foreign minister, mind you, anyway, when he got off the plane at Orly Airport, there was a lot of reporters, foreign correspondents, anxious to ask him about what his country had done. At this time, the Cambodians weren't being available to us, to anybody from the West. And they said, Mr. Minister, what happened? And he said, I don't understand. He said, well, don't you know? One of the reporters said, the Cambodian Navy has seized an American merchant ship, and the President Ford had to bomb Cambodia in order to free the man. And according to North Vietnamese, the Cambodian minister then said, what Cambodian Navy? And what it was, as we later learned, was a bunch of Thai fishermen. Thai. They weren't Cambodian at all. I mean, the whole thing was just ludicrous beyond belief. The reporting on it was impossible. By and large, I guess one could say, why did I do it? I didn't do it either. But nobody did go after the Marines who were killed and wounded. I mean, the ones who were wounded, to try and find out what had happened. We never did get a coherent story of what the policy was. And obviously what it was is we just felt we had to show a little might. After being licked in Southeast Asia, we had to show a little might, so we just threw away a couple lives. What's a few more lives? All right, I don't mind any of that. That's the way the ball works in international diplomacy these days. It's just what bothered me was the jingoism of the American press, who obviously hadn't learned much from Watergate. I don't think we're going to keep the world safe for democracy. We in the American Press Corps. I don't think that's our function anyway. And I just think that if I sound overly cynical, I'm afraid I just might be. I'm probably, we have learned some things. We're tougher on people. We're more questioning. We're quicker to look into abuses, etc. because of Watergate. But by and large, that the press has somehow emerged as a hero, and I guess this is my thesis, is, as I said, standing every fact, I think, on its head. And I wish somebody would disagree with me. Maybe somebody wants to disagree with me. Anyway, that's my bit. And I'm here to take as many questions as long as you want, and I'll talk about anything. I'm a delegate from the States. Yeah, sure, use microphones. All right, go ahead, take them. Somebody grab it, quick. Any question? All right, shoot, start off.
I was wondering if you ever...
Just speak loud.
All right, I was wondering if you have ever felt used by your sources or whatever. I'm thinking specifically about the James I happened to come across an old New York magazine which said that you had told us the story that he was let go because he was in charge of domestic spying, but New York Magazine said, in fact, he was let go because of internal policy problems in the CIA. You ever felt that you've been used?
Oh, I'm sure I've been used. I mean, that's one of the risks you take, and you try and do as much as you can. The story you're talking about suggested that I'd been hard on Angleton, because Angleton wasn't as responsible. James Angleton was the head of counterintelligence, and I'm here to say, as close to a certified madman as you can get, inside the CIA, who, he was the head of counterintelligence who, I'll tell you a story about him. This is a man in charge of making sure that the Russians don't get into the United States of America. happens to be a devout cold warrior, which is all right, that's part of his job. But the morning I wrote that story in the New York Times, it was December the 22nd, 1974, I wrote the story about domestic spying and had a lot on Angleton, naming him. He had been named, I don't know if he'd been named publicly before. Reporters knew who he was. I don't think anybody ever said he runs counterintelligence and also that he was involved in this. And perhaps I was wrong in the extent of his involvement, but he was certainly involved to a more significant degree than he publicly admitted. Anyway, the point is that he called me up that morning at home, and he's then in his 60s. He'd been in the CIA 31 years, and about 8:30 Sunday morning, I mean, literally, at my phone's in the book. I was living in Washington then, and he said I talked to him once on the phone, and he threatened. First he threatened me a little bit, then he offered to trade me secrets if I didn't run the story. I mean, really quite a bizarre way to run the America's super spy. And then he said to me on the phone, he said, do you know what you've done? And I said, no. And he said, my wife, I've been married for I don't know how many years, 30 years or so, got married right out of Yale. She left me this morning because she did not know until today that I worked for the CIA until you named me as a CIA agent in the New York Times. And I was upset. What could I say? I was, wow. I said, wow, I'm sorry, maybe you should have told her. I don't know what I said. I felt I was genuinely upset. And I felt badly about it, I felt badly that his life was so crazy that I ended up in the middle of it, But anyway, I hung up the phone, and then I called a friend of mine, a guy who was a friend of Angleton's, a social acquaintance of Angleton's, who knew Angleton very well, who also was in the CIA, who was, I guess we call him a source, somebody I could trust. And I told him, I called him up, and I woke him up too, and I said, I just had a very disturbing phone call. Jim Angleton just called me and told me that his wife's name was Cecily, that's right. He said that as Cecily had left him this morning because she learned for the first time that he was in the CIA upon reading it in the New York Times. And my friend laughed, like he laughed uproariously. And he said, oh my God, he said, first of all, Cy, he said, I've been to parties with Jim and Cecily at the agency for 25 years at headquarters there. And secondly, she left him 3 years ago. He's the guy and head of counterintelligence in the CIA. I mean, you know what it is? It's not Kafkaesque at all. I mean, it's inside out. It's Alice in Wonderland. It's Lewis Carroll. That's what it is. Anyway, go ahead.
Your old neighbor and former CBS member of the press corps, Daniel Shore, I'm wondering what your opinion is on the fact that he receives so little help from his fellow journalists.
Well, as somebody
why?
I must say, somebody who did help him, I'll make that clear, or at least as much as I could, and who likes him and respects him a great deal. I think it's because we in Washington, the press corps in Washington tends to be a very much inside baseball game. You tend to like people who go along. You tend not to like people who make waves. Dan makes waves. Not only is he a good reporter, sometimes he isn't very nice. Sometimes he steals your story if you're a little slow. He's a very aggressive, terrific newspaper man who, by the way, if you watch television like everybody does, he's one of the few guys on network TV who doesn't give you non-news news. He used to sometimes give you real news, really good news on television, even though he had 3 minutes to do it. He wasn't, and he was a professional, and he caused a great deal of envy among his peers and inferiors. And I think that had a lot more to do with it. I think a lot of people walked away from Dan Shore, and it's too bad. But don't bleed for him. He's going to have the last word. He's going to write a very good book about it all.
Your own newspaper, the New York Times, condemned what he did in giving it.
I would that it was mine. I'm not responsible. I am simply a technician. I talked to I'm doing a story on one of the largest. I've been doing corporate stuff, and let me tell you, it's a lot easier to kick the government. I live in New York now, so naturally I've been doing a lot of stuff on corporations. And let me tell you, if your corner grocery store did what some of these multinational corporations did, why he'd be in jail over stomped on by his neighbors, of course. But a corner drugstore doesn't have the lawyers. But anyway, I'm into one. It's hard for me to get going on this stuff because you work a long time on a company that does some wrong, and by the time you're ready to write a story, they've changed every book and every record. You know what I mean? They've got you dead, and if you publish because they've got libel, they'll come into court and murder you. These guys know more about predating documents than anybody in the White House ever thought of. So it's very frustrating. But I am working on one big story now. I've been working on it for a long time in 4 countries. involving just an incredible ripoff. Basically, the way you look at it is, I look at it as stockholder ripoff. You know, they're ripping off the stockholders. But I talked to a lawyer who was closely involved yesterday, a very big, heavy senior muckamuck on Wall Street. Talks like the Buckleys. And, well, you know, anyway, portentously. And I called this guy yesterday. I finally am coming out of the cold a little bit, and I'm beginning to let the firm know how much I know, or how much I think I know. And I called him up and I said I was interested in this certain, it involves shipping, and in case anybody wonders, most ships most American-owned ships are generally owned in Liberia by holding companies registered in Panama with the bearer notes and stuff, usually in some lawyer's safe in London. That's generally the way, or Geneva. And nobody, no name anywhere. You know, I mean, you know, for obvious time. Anyway, I asked him about this certain transaction, which must have brought a shutter up his back. I have somebody in the inside, so I know my facts are right, although I may never be able to prove them. And this lawyer comes on with, well, he said, I just, I don't make judgments on what I do, Mr. Hersh. I'm a technician. I'm asked to execute certain tax mechanisms, and that's what I do. You know, really, I got that talk yesterday. I think we ought to, if we could somehow get rid of lawyers, I guess the world would be improved 100%. That's what I think. Not journalists, lawyers. I just, you know, they're just so unbelievable. Yeah, yes, sir, over there.
Okay, do you feel that journals, specialized journals such as Counterspy in Washington, serve a constructive purpose when they print articles like listing specific names and addresses of CIA agents in foreign capitals, and when they describe the activities of the CIA in specific foreign countries? And do you think that the press should also become involved in this sort of activity?
Well, look, I happen to believe very strongly in the First Amendment, and I think anybody's entitled in the United States to print what they want. I personally would probably not want to print the name of a CIA agent because he's a CIA agent. I think that I don't see any great purpose in that. I think it's sort of a little bit of exhibitionism. On the other hand, I wouldn't want to say that anybody shouldn't do anything. I think anybody can do what they want as long as it's within the realm of the First Amendment. I happen to think, as I said, and I mean this very seriously, I can conceive of no secret that would make a good story, that's worth holding. I just can't conceive of it. There are some things, at a seminar earlier where I talked about this, there are some things, I guess, that I think would be detrimental to American security. For example, the basis for our nuclear posture is the Polaris submarine fleet, our underwater submarines, each with 39 or so multiple independently targeted warheads, MIRVs. That's the basis and that's the backbone, and presumably if one were to get the travel plans for those, there's 20 in the water, probably there's 39 in all, maybe 20 in the water at any time. If one could get the travel plans, where they were going to be underwater, what depth, what turns they're going to be taking for the next 24 hours and published it, I guess that would help the Russians a lot. They would know how to track our people, they would perhaps gear in. That would be very mischievous, it seems to me. On the other hand, that would make one hell of a lousy newspaper story. You know, America's Polaris fleet are going to take 22 right-degree turns next week, you know? So, you know what I'm saying? At all levels, one uses common sense, but I certainly wouldn't want to ever say that Counterspy magazine doesn't have a right to publish whatever it goddamn pleases without thinking that it's jeopardizing the national security of the United States. And I also reject totally the argument that because they mentioned the name of our CIA station chief, Mr. Welch, in Greece, in Athens, before he, you know, if they published his name before he was killed, that they and somehow the left in America or the newspapers and journalists were somehow responsible. The fact is that most people in the intelligence business used to judge who's doing what in the CIA by watching the CIA station chief in Athens lived at the same house every year. And they would change every year or two, and you could almost watch and see what's going on inside the CIA by seeing who's getting promoted into the house. So everybody knew who everybody is. Everybody always knows. You get to know a lot of CIA agents, and they will tell you that the one person they could really let down the hair with and talk business with was the KGB guy, wherever they were stationed. I'm serious. I know you all think it's a joke, but I'm telling you, a lot of CIA guys in small countries end up being very friendly with the wives, and they, you know, and their counterpart, their Russian counterpart. They can talk shop with them. You know, which, you know, look, there's no sense in advocating getting rid of it. It's a good payroll, keeps a lot of guys out of, you know, if they weren't doing that, they probably were, you know, who knows, they might be running for president, you know. I don't see anything that necessarily would rule out anybody from that office. At least it's clear there's no great discernment involved. Anyway, yeah.
I'd like to ask you a few questions, but start something concrete first. About the My Lai exposure, you know.
My Lai.
My Lai, yes.
Yeah. My Lai is a Grove Press book.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is that, the My Lai massacre was part of a CIA operation called Operation Phoenix, which is a genocide operation which ended up in murdering about several 100,000 Vietnamese individuals.
But they murdered, the official numbers that we say was 20,000 up. Genocide is 20,000 or 700,000, I'll concede.
Well, that's the official number, is 20,000. There's probably a lot more involved. And what I'm saying is that you, by laundering this story to the Dispatch News Service, you sort of like use a classical tactic of misdirection. You obscure what was...
Why don't you just read what it says or something?
Pardon me?
You're reading from that article?
You want to read from the article?
Why don't you just read it? Yeah.
Okay. The essence of the My Lai expose, quote unquote, was a horrid tactic of misdirection. A tremendous brouhaha was orchestrated around the murder of over 100 Vietnamese civilians by one Lieutenant William Calley, while the murder of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians by the CIA's genocidal Operation Phoenix, of which My Lai was just one moment, was vigorously concealed. While the Phoenix pacification program continued to be test run undisturbed in Vietnam for later, slightly more sophisticated application in U.S. cities, the Rockefeller forces used My Lai as a club against the Nixon, White House, and the Pentagon's military traditionalists. To simply publish the My Lai story in the New York Times would have made the phoniness of the venture a bit too transparent. So in 1969, the CIA leaked information on the 1968 My Lai bloodbath to quote-unquote freelance reporter Seymour Hersh, who obediently covered up the CIA's bloody hands and turned the full weight of his moral indignation on stooge Calley. Through an FIJ-directed publicity stunt, Hersh's story was ostentatiously shut out of the major press. At this point, the fly-by-night Dispatch News Service, founded by the Fund for Investigative Journalism and published by one David Obst, who is a financier of Ramparts magazine and a veteran organizer for the CIA's 1960 Schwarzer Kapelle project in the deserters movement in Europe, sprang into existence on cue to publish Hersh's stories and, quote-unquote, embarrass the major press into carrying it. The affair became a cause célèbre, and immediately thereafter, My Lai became headlines across the country, syndicated by New York Times. The charade over, Seymour Hersh was embraced by the Times and as its new star investigative reporter, and the Dispatch News Service has appeared into oblivion almost as quickly as it had emerged, only to reappear later in exactly the same role. Yeah. In a final result, just one more sentence. In a final insult to the public's intelligence, Hersh's expose was published in a book form in 1972 under the title Cover-Up. Would you comment on this, please?
It's absolutely correct. Incredibly perceptive.
Okay.
Okay, thank
so
you.
What are you doing here acting like a criminal?
Huh?
What are you doing here covering up for crimes against humanity? Why aren't you in the Nuremberg docket for Nazi war criminals? Why aren't you put away for life for doing these things?
Okay. That's fine.
Thank you. You are a fraud, aren't you?
Well, I don't know.
You are a liar. You are coming here. We're paying you $2,000 so you can lie to us here.
I'll tell you what. As they say, why don't you see me privately afterwards?
Well, why don't you discuss this with us in an intelligent manner? I'll give you some information here.
It's okay. No, it's all right. You've made your point. I think that's fair enough.
Okay.
Nobody's not giving you a chance to make your point. Yeah. Anybody else?
Beyond Calley, who was ultimately held responsible for My Lai?
Nobody.
And what was done about it?
The thing that's fascinating about the My Lai thing is that it's awfully hard for me to have sympathy, by the way, for Calley, because not only was he, part of me says, yeah, Calley was a scapegoat. He's the only guy that was found guilty of anything in connection with My Lai. And the other part just recalls, from talking to all those kids and putting it all together, how many people he murdered that day. And I keep on thinking of the one time when they had a ditch full of people they were executing. And after they got done executing, a baby somehow survived underneath its mother. The mother protected it under her stomach. And this 2 or 3-year-old baby got up and climbed all full of blood out of the pile and started running screaming across the ditch up the paddies. And 4 or 5 guys who were there told me the same story. Guys who were actually involved in shooting and very grisly stuff. And they all said this even got them. It was a really awfully horrifying moment. And everybody stopped for a second, and suddenly Calley grabbed a weapon from one of the troops who had been shooting and ran over, and as some kid said, ran up behind the kid, knocked him down, and plugged him. So it's very hard for me to have a hell of a lot of sympathy for Cali. I think Cali's done very well. He's come, I mean, he's, I'm sure he's done very well by it. On the other hand, the Army failed as an institution, which is no surprise to anybody. What is a surprise, I stayed with that story for 3 years, actually. I did write 2 books about it, in fact. Not only one about My Lai, but the one about how the Army covered it up. And it's very hard to mobilize people about something like that when you have a failure so completely and so totally. And let me assure you that My Lai was just one of many, as you all know by now. It was probably the largest, but it was one of many such episodes. And the war was basically, I think history's going to judge us, the United States. The history books of the 20th century are going to talk in terms of the Nazi atrocity, the Armenian atrocity, and the Vietnamese atrocity. And that's an awful hard thing for us to take. We're all part of it. That is we in the States. And so Cali had one other function that was terribly useful. I don't think the My Lai story itself shook up America very much, even though a lot of people say it did. My own perception was that those who hated the war had a reason to hate it more, and those who liked the war had a reason to find a way to rationalize it. I think it converted some people, but not nearly as many as what happened later. What happened was the story broke in 69, and through 69 and 70 there was some debate about it. But Cali was eventually ordered to stand court-martial, and he did so in the spring of 71. And then in around March or April or May, it was in the spring of 71, after about a 6 or 8 week trial that got a lot of publicity. And if you remember, Cali was all over the newspapers then. He was on the cover of Time, Newsweek, Look magazine, which rapidly went out of business. Everybody, Cali was then playing, he was the only guy on trial. He was inviting newspaper men into his house. He had a little house, and he had a girlfriend, and he served drinks, and he was full of, wry, whimsical comments. And so America, what happened is, over that year and a half, a lot of middle America, and what I'm talking about is nothing I can obviously, it's what I'm sure you're sick of hearing professors describe as gut feelings. It's pure unverified feeling I have, but I was around all during this time. A lot of America really got involved. A lot of Americans, middle Americans I guess you can call them, a lot of people in the boonies who never made a moral judgment or thought, or had a thought in terms of right and wrong about Vietnam. If that's what our country, if that's what our president says to do, that's what we got to do, that kind of, fighting the communists. Somehow, Cali for them got to be an issue. Cali got into that. It was wrong for the government to persecute Cali. He was a good boy, he'd done nothing. Millions of Americans who made no other judgments about Vietnam, whether it was right or wrong, the murder and maim there, made a judgment about Cali. He was a good boy. And then a group of Cali's peers, captains, majors, and colonels, decided that he was guilty of mass murder, and that was it. That tore the roof up. I had more trouble when all during the year, people say, what kind of trouble did you have from people threatening you and stuff like that? Nothing at all in relation to what I got when Cali was found guilty. I mean, we really literally had to leave our house practically, in a sense, You couldn't touch the phone. People, really, it was just insanity. People really got mad all of a sudden at me again, I assume at others. And what happened is, these poor people had made a judgment about Vietnam, the first one they made, and it blew up in their face. I think after Cali's conviction, I think Nixon was impossible for Nixon to rally public support for Vietnam. And then I think Cali had a lot of importance, and the My Lai thing had a lot of importance. I think then the conviction and the disillusionment of so many millions of people, I think had a really vitiating effect on the power of the White House to mobilize public opinion. To me, that's by far the most significant thing about My Lai. Because the mere fact of itself, I think, still provokes discussions. You'd be amazed at how people hold. Hey, come on, Ron Haberly. Ron Haberly was the photographer. Remember who took the color photos of My Lai? Remember the photos of everybody in the ditch? Well, when I first ran into Haberly, after starting to do the story, he had those photographs. He used to go, he'd left the Army. And he used to go give speeches to Rotary clubs, in Ohio. And he used to give a slideshow on Vietnam, and he used to show those very slides as an example of, boy, here, look what happens to the civilians who get in this war. These people all got chewed up. He showed the ditch slide. He used to show them all over Cleveland. And it wasn't a story. That's what I meant when I said earlier about the joke about the monkeys. Stories are stories. There's something very ephemeral, very vague, very impossible to track down about the newspaper business and what makes a story. And that's all the more reason people shouldn't go around thinking, you know, that, again, that we're your saviors. Let's go back, yeah.
I agree with you that the press is not the saviors of America or anywhere else, but that's another thing. On points that you, from earlier this afternoon, for instance, Truman created the CIA, and now Truman is a folk hero. They have a television program with someone impersonating him and saying all the witty things he said. Whether that, you know, he'll turn out, history will judge him one way or the other, it's hard to say, but it was Truman who created the CIA, and FDR, who many people still love, said to a group of college students, "I will never, never, never send you to a foreign war." And he looked them in the eye in 1938 or 39, I'm not sure of the date, and said that. So if you're talking about your presidents lying to you, I don't know. I don't think you should. Nixon, I'm not trying to defend Nixon, but...
Well, I thought I made the point right away that what I was saying about Nixon could have been said about Johnson, many aspects. What they thought was not just inherent to Nixon. I think there's no question that Nixon abused his trust far more than FDR or Truman. And there's no question you can find, look, a politician's lie. You know, I've just told you the great truth. You now know it. And they lie systematically, and they lie about everything. Jimmy Carter one day says Lyndon Johnson's no good, then down in Texas he says he didn't mean that. He just didn't quite mean it that way, you know. So they lie, but I think there's no question that if you're trying to equate what FDR may or may not have said, and I'm sure he said what you said he did, with what Nixon said or did, I don't think there's any basis. I don't think there's any fair comparison. Is that your point?
No, two others. One, I don't really care if you're CIA or he's CIA or you're both CIA or FBI or whatever you are.
Savak. I'm the Iranian secret police right here. I bet you don't know about Savak.
That's what it boils down to. I mean, it becomes mindless when the two of you say you're CIA and he says you're CIA. I mean, what does it matter anymore?
I assure you he's not CIA.
But how can I trust you?
Well,
are you CIA?
Okay, let's go.
There's a very simple way to find out who's in the CIA, who's got the program. We as the U.S. Labor Party, North American Labor Party, have a program for social society. You know, nobody else has one.
Look,
you want to be intelligent.
I'm very serious when I said I'll talk to you later. I'll really be glad to sit down and talk to you. I don't see why we should bore everybody to death. I really don't.
Talk now?
Well, no, I hate to tell you. Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's fair. I really don't. Both of you, I just don't think it's fair. Yeah.
Do you feel that the Freedom of Information Act in the United States, as amended, as it is now, is an adequate document, or do you think that the exemptions that they have are too broad and that's still
Listen,
too much?
let me tell you, the Freedom of Information Act, as initially passed, said that you could go ask the government agency for whatever you want, and the government agency then could decide itself whether or not it was whether or not your information that you wanted was detrimental to national security. There was a great amendment made last year, or the year before last, that said that in that case they have to take it to a third party, a judge, a federal judge, and the judge has to read the document and decide. And I think that's a terrific step in the right direction. Judges still are very chicken, still too afraid to go against if a government agency says this is classified and detrimental to national security. Judges are generally too afraid, too cowardly, but it's a big step. I think it's a terrifically useful tool that isn't used enough. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask you a philosophical question, because I've never had a chance to ever speak to a journalist before, okay? With all the absurdities of life that you've just described, what do you see your role ultimately as?
Well, look, how about, let's just call it, everything's fortuitous. I don't think it's so absurd. I think it's just fortuitous. We got rid of Nixon because it was fortuitous. We just had some breaks, etc. You used the word absurdity. It's not quite an absurdity. It's just that something that plays on Monday might not play on Thursday. I don't know. I mean, you know.
Is it all going to be the same in 100 years?
Oh, I think things are definitely on. I think the fact that somebody in the New York Times can go around and rant and rave about what most of the press do, including his own press, obviously, is a step in the right direction. I feel pretty much unfettered to say what I think and do. I don't feel like I'm a captive of any newspaper agency or anybody. And I think that's a step in the right direction. I think reporters have gotten tremendous freedom in the last 10 years or so. I've sort of come out of the Reporters, by and large, are brighter. The ones we're hiring are more sophisticated, no more. I think the level, I think the number of reporters who are willing to look beyond the facts are increasing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, no, I'm sorry.
I like to turn around, like you're saying things from the point of view of a journalist, but I'd like to talk about how the public perceives journalists. You can influence public opinion to do anything you want.
That's right.
So
Not
you're
quite,
ultimately performing a job and it's entertainment or what have you, or do you feel you're writing history?
Oh my God, certainly not writing history.
Well,
Some of us think we do, and some of us think we're doing entertainment, and some of us don't think. You know, I mean,
do you respect the public that you write to? Or do you feel that they're just a manipulable blob of plasticine that, you know?
Well, look, I worry about, look, I'm lucky. I work for the New York Times. A lot of very smart people read what I write. That's why I work for the New York Times. That's why I didn't work, I used to work for something called the New Yorker. I worked there, and I worked for other magazines and the AP, and I've chosen the New York Times because I think I will have the most influence. I'm just speaking, I've got to narrow your question a little bit. I think I will have the most influence. Maybe, you know, this is a judgment I made. I think I know the story I write today will be read by ex-corporation presidents and ex-government officials and ex-other newspaper people and ex-opinion makers at whatever that body is. They you know, and you know, either through the Times or through its news.